In the 1960s, Toho Godzilla movies were all the rage in Japan, so it's only natural that someone would eventually say, "Hey, let's do one of these too." This someone would be Toho's rival Daiei, who in 1965 presented to the world Giant Monster Gamera, a movie about a giant fire-breathing reptile born from radiation that comes out of the sea to lay waste to Japan, in one of the most blatant ripoffs in mainstream media that makes you wonder how the hell didn't Toho took those guys to court. The first Gamera movie was a success that prompted the Japanese studio to put out another half-dozen flicks starring the Beyblade spinning, jet speed flying turtle in increasingly zanier situations over the following years. Because, you see, in many ways Gamera was a Captain Marvel to Godzilla's Superman, in the sense that he's a blatant copy of the original character with a more fantasy-oriented edge and a bigger affinity with children. The biggest difference would be that even in its heyday, Gamera was never able to outshine the Big G. Maybe that explains why there was no lawsuit. So you can see why in the early 1970s, the franchise faded away sooner than its rival, and a particularly awful movie in the 1980s notwithstanding, stayed pretty much dormant for decades. This changed in 1995, when the character's 30th anniversary prompted Daiei to once again follow on Toho's footsteps and give the giant turtle its own dark and edgy reboot. No, really. Directed by Shusuke Kaneko, written by Kazunori Ito with special effects by Shinji Higuchi, a soundtrack by Otani, and actually distributed by Toho of all people, the Gamera Trilogy, as it would later become known, would be collectively praised as the absolute best thing since garlic bread. And the films are fine and all, but there's only so much I can talk about this sort of movie before it's starting to sound repetitive. So instead of making a single video for each one of these, I'll be covering all three in one swing. So here we go. Guardian of the Universe takes off from the premise of Gamera being a genetically engineered monster created by the Atlanteans to fight the Jaws, a race of also genetically engineered people-eating monsters created by the Atlanteans that got out of control and started attacking its own creators. Gamera managed to eventually control the Jaws, but it was too little too late and its creators had already been extinct. So the turtle entered a long slumber, waiting for when the world needed him again. Fast forward several thousand years and the Jaws started resurfacing near Japan, prompting Gamera to come back for a second round against his old rivals. Oh, and this time he's magically bound to this girl that always looked either high or constipated, sometimes both. She's actually not really important for the plot or anything, I just wanted to make the joke. Despite the exceedingly fantastical premise and Gamera still being, well, Gamera, the movie is most certainly compromised in giving the franchise a more down-to-earth approach, thanks in no small part to the plot having a very nice crescendo that gives the whole thing a thrilling sense of urgency. The stakes keep on growing until we reach a climatic final battle between Gamera and an abnormal Super Jaws where everything is going to be decided. This is by itself already a major departure from the light-hearted and carefree Showa movies. Another departure from the franchise roots is its production values, which are surprisingly high given the relatively tight budget of the flick. Guardian was made with about half as much money as a Godzilla flick from the same period, but it's not, as you can tell. The special effects are pretty top notch and mostly on par with the ones from the other franchise. Mostly. And that is honestly the best compliment this movie can receive. It is just as good as Godzilla. An impressive feat by its own right considering the franchise had always held a very distant second place to its peer. Suddenly Gamera was not a joke anymore, and people unironically liked the character, which meant the filmmakers had to follow suit with sequels just as good as the first one. And they eventually would, but just not with the follow-up. Released 1 year after Guardian of the Universe, Attack of Legion is easily the worst of the trio. I mean, saying like that, it sounds like this is a god-awful movie, which is far from the truth. From a technical point of view, this one is just as competent as its predecessor, making for a really entertaining piece of media. It's even the closest thing of a big monster versus smaller monsters movie I've been wanting to see since Godzilla vs Megaguirus. It is just that its story is lacking. For a start, the plot is basically a rehash of the previous one. Once again we see the Earth being attacked by a swarm of relatively small sized people-eating monsters, which here are aptly named, well, Legion, that eventually give place to a much bigger and more dangerous creature with the intention of procreating and taking over the planet. But unlike the previous movie, the sense of urgency and looming dread feels pretty artificial here. Gamera accidentally nukes an entire city not halfway through the flick, but everyone moves on like nothing had happened, you know. For comparison, it takes him doing much less in the following film for the army to decide that enough is enough and he should be destroyed. Moments like this feel very inconsequential, as if they were there for the simple reason of this movie trying to one-up its predecessor. It's almost as if they knew this movie had nothing new to offer. Moreover, Gamera feels oddly disjointed from the main action. It's not like the monster isn't there, obviously. The problem is more like that he's just kinda there. Where both the villain and the hero had intertwined journeys in Guardian, culminating in an unavoidable final confrontation, Attack sees the giant turtle doing what he does only because he's protector of the Earth. I know it's pretty weird to ask for better character motivations in a monster movie, but bear with me that the previous installment already had a more fleshed out relationship between the two creatures, so this film feels like a step down. Ultimately, Attack of Legion's biggest problem is exactly this, having to be compared to the first movie. It feels kinda flat and haphazardly put together when compared to Guardian of the Universe, which mostly hurts the perception of what is not a bad movie at all in its own right. Thankfully, any mistakes this film might have made would be more than rectified by the third installment of the franchise. Since the second Gamera movie fell short of meeting Daiei's financial expectations, the studio took its time in developing the follow-up. When it finally came out in 1999, everyone was pretty much blown away by it. Revenge of Iris is where the trilogy peaked. But what is it that makes this film so special? Well, for one, it takes a very dark and cynical approach on the giant monster genre, taking a nosedive into the deconstruction territory. Whereas most kaiju films treat the destruction of the monsters just seriously enough to justify them being the main conflict of the movie, Revenge of Iris analyzes the toll this kind of disaster happening over and over again would have on people. 3 years after the events of the last movie, everyone has had enough of Gamera, who keeps leveling entire towns in his fight against the Jaws, which keep on popping all over the world due to global warming or something. As a response to all the destruction he has caused, Gamera is declared public enemy number 1, with his destruction becoming a priority for Japan's armed forces. Also full of hate for the monster is the young Ayana Hirazaka, who saw her whole family being stomped by him during the battle against Super Jaws. Now living with her uncles and cousins in a small village, Ayana never forgot what Gamera did to her, becoming a brooding loner, tormented by the local bullies for her reclusive personality. That is, until the fateful day when she stumbles upon a mysterious creature she nicknames Iris, after her dead cat, and soon establishes a connection with it that goes beyond just the emotional, with the two sharing some sort of psychic link. What in other movies would be the start of an awesome adventure between a girl and her giant monster, here is a living nightmare, as Iris channels all the hatred inside Ayana, going after the target of the girl's contempt and feeding on the entire village where she lives, including her bullies and her family. The monster's ultimate goal being, of course, to grow big enough to be able to tackle the giant turtle himself and get rid of him for good. All this really depressing stuff helps drive home the point of how complicated is Gamera's relationship with humankind. Basically, the monster is identified here as the protection of the earth, but doesn't seem to care much about humans. This places him in a fuzzy gray area of morality, sort of like a necessary evil or a destructive savior. What marks this movie as an interesting evolution of the trilogy's previous films, making for a very dense and thoughtful film, the like of which I don't think I've ever seen before. While there have been serious kaiju movies before, none of them trying to give a closer look at the very nature of this sort of story. But this is not to mean the flick is out to get you depressed. Well, not just depressed. There's a lot of fun to be found in what is absolutely the climax of the filmmaker's craft and ingenuity when it comes to special effects. The action scenes here are absolutely spectacular, but the highlight goes, weirdly enough, to one of the least flashy moments of the flick. In its final moments, the movie takes Gamera and a fully grown Iris to inside an airport terminal. I don't think I've ever seen a giant monster fight taking place indoors, and I think it's because everyone thought, just like I did, that it will look lame. But it doesn't, it's great, probably the most memorable part of the movie, most likely because it really sells the scale of the creature, something that even the outdoor set had difficulty doing. Revenge of Iris ends with an exhausted Gamera having won the battle against his enemy. But there is no time for recovering. A massive flock of Jaws is heading toward Japan, and only the giant turtle can stop it, so he heads into the danger, ready to fight one last time for the future of the world. As this movie too would fall short of Daiei's expectations, we never received a fourth installment, so we were left hanging. But I think it's okay. That's an impactful conclusion that really sells everything the trilogy was trying to convey, and I honestly can't think of a more fitting end to it. Gamera's trilogy has a very odd legacy to it. On one hand, it was incapable to move the same numbers Godzilla did during the same period, or even change the character's overall image among the larger public. Although, to be fair, neither did Heisei Godzilla. On the other hand though, it's undeniable the long-lasting impact these three films had in the genre. For a start, they brought into the spotlight the directors of the two best Godzilla films of this century. In the eyes of many, these films have elevated this type of flick from mere spectacle to something much more thoughtful and provocative, as proven by the fact that all the three of them were nominated for and even won awards previously never recognized to films like this. And more than anything else, these three installments of the Gamera franchise would shape the future of monster movies, which got much more, or at least even more, grounded afterwards. Most of them anyway. If you want definitive proof of the everlasting impact of the trilogy, look no further than Legendary Pictures' incarnation of Godzilla, an ancient monster with ties to long-gone civilizations who rise from the bottom of the ocean to hunt down a known enemy awakened by human action before it can procreate and take over the world. Humans are not sure if they should or not trust this creature, but they really have no choice. Add to that very similar set pieces and plot beats, and while I'm not saying these movies are Godzilla in name only, you can see how the Gamera trilogy was one of the biggest, if not the biggest, influence to the American Godzilla, more so than its namesake even. Gamera would receive one more movie a few years later, this time completely unrelated to the previous three, but that was it. There was a short 5-minute long film screened at the 2015 Comic-Con as both a celebration of the character's 50th anniversary and a proof of concept for a new Gamera movie, but nothing ever came of it. There hasn't been any film of the franchise in almost 15 years, and In all honesty, it's unlikely this will change anytime soon due to it having been proven unprofitable and the main character hardly a box office pull. So in a way the giant turtle faded as soon as it peaked, but the impact of what Shusuke Kaneko and those others did in the late 90s lives on in the memories of all who saw it. They treated Gamera with the respect its fans always thought it deserved, and in turn managed to make the turtle really cool for everyone. And that's what really matters. Once a second grade Godzilla knockoff, the friend of all children was now a respected character among the Hall of Film monsters, a movie legend in its own right, and that no one was going to take from him. Unless you watched Mystery Science Theater 2000, in which case Gamera will always be a joke.
Gamera, Gamera, Gamera is really neat. Gamera is filled with meat. We've been eating Gamera.
Okay, enough of monster movies for now. Next time I'll try something different. Let's see how it turns out.